Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Alex Hoyer, in for Elaine Cha. From war and disease to famine and homelessness, Earth has a lot of problems. Yes, there are so many people who do the right thing and who are working to make our communities better places to live, but what if we could start over? Can we do better in space, perhaps, than we've done here on Earth? That's the central topic of today's show, as we bring you highlights of an event we recorded last month before a live audience at the St. Louis Science Center's James S. McDonnell Planetarium. Presented by Missouri Humanities, the event featured host Elaine Cha in conversation with astrophysicist Erika Nesvold. Nesvold is a podcast host, an astrophysicist engineer at Universe Sandbox, and the author of Off Earth: Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space.
Thank you all. I'd like to start with kind of who you are and what it is you do. So we were talking about the flight that you took coming in from Charlotte. When someone sitting next to you on a plane asks you what you do, how do you respond?
That's an interesting question. There's a joke among astronomers and astrophysicists, which are kind of the same thing, where that we say if someone next to you on an airplane asks you what you do, if you want to talk to them, you say astronomer, and if you don't want to talk to them, you say astrophysicist, because it sounds a little intimidating. But both of them are the same thing. Astronomers study the night sky and use really massive telescopes to try to figure out as much as they can, studying these giant objects we can't actually go out and touch. And astrophysics involves using our understanding of math and especially of physics here on Earth to try to figure out what's going on up there and to use our observations to try to figure out new things about physics. Mm-hmm. And so as a research scientist, I was looking for planets around other stars, so exoplanets, and I was doing that by studying the physics of asteroid belts, which sound kind of boring, but they look really cool in telescope images. And I was making computer simulations of how those asteroid belts would get shaped by planets. And then I used that experience to get really a dream job with a company that makes a video game called Universe Sandbox. It's really just a fantastic, beautiful astrophysics simulation that you can actually interact with, which none of my research stuff could really do. You can go in there and you can throw the moon at the Earth and see what happens. You can slow the Earth down so that one side always faces the sun and one side always faces away, and you can watch one side get all melty and the other side freezes. And you can look at galaxies and black holes, just tons of fun. Mm-hmm. And it's all based on real science, and so it's a way to give people who don't study astrophysics a more intuitive understanding because they're actually doing these things themselves of what's going on up there.
Mm-hmm. How did you get interested in this in the first place?
So astrophysics I got into because I was very good at math and I watched way too much science fiction as a kid. It's a pretty common recipe among astronomers. And then a few years into being a research astrophysicist, I had a chance to go out and visit Silicon Valley, California, as part of NASA's Frontier Development Laboratory. We were doing some research about planetary defense, but I got to meet a bunch of people, a bunch of entrepreneurs in this new space industry. So these are the people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and a lot of smaller companies who want to start making money off of space, and they're trying to figure out how to make rocket launches cheaper, how to mine asteroids and make money that way. And a lot of these people think that we humans should go out and be living in space on a more permanent basis. And that's something I had always been interested in. So I was really excited to talk to these business people, these entrepreneurs, but I was kind of disappointed by my conversations with them. I would ask them questions about things that I thought were going to be really important, like how do we avoid contaminating the moon's environment if we go up and try to mine the moon's surface? Or what do we do about protecting labor rights if your workers are living and working in outer space? And they just kept saying things like, oh, well, we'll worry about that later. which didn't seem right to me. But I also knew that as someone who had just mostly taken math and science classes in college and beyond, that I didn't have the right answers to these either. We needed to think about social science, use the expertise of social scientists, and I needed to consult with people in the humanities as well. And so, like any good millennial, I responded to this by coming back home and making a podcast and talking to all these people. And that was sort of my first entryway into thinking about space ethics.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about what happened in Silicon Valley, you said, what folks were saying to you was, we'll worry about that later. Who was that we? And how was it tied to your own research into the fields of humanities like history, sociology, anthropology, and ethics?
That's a really great question. It comes up a lot in my work, is what do we mean by we? The people I was talking to, I was asking them questions about what their company was going to do, and so they were answering on behalf of their company. But I think a lot of the people who, especially the companies who were talking about humanity having this big grand future in space where we're expanding our civilization into space, they like to talk about space on behalf of all communities. So when they say we, they mean the whole species. But they don't often consult all of humanity, because that's pretty tricky to do, right? And so there tends to be a big disconnect between the very small and pretty specific group of people who's planning to actually go out and do activities in space and the entire population of the planet that they're speaking for. And that disconnect is where a lot of these ethical problems lie.
Mm-hmm. And when we think of Silicon Valley, I certainly have something in my mind about race, socioeconomics, the level of education. How much of that do you think was part of the reason there was this attitude of, we'll get to it later, which could be interpreted as, that is not important, not only now, but that's really none of our concern?
Well, certainly, the quick way to say that is that most of these people that I was talking to are rich white guys. That's the shorthand for it. But more specifically, these are people who were trained in things either business or in science and engineering. So they didn't have, just like me, they didn't have a background in the humanities, in thinking about social justice and human rights, or even thinking about history. The history of colonization on Earth is something, especially in the U.S. American school system, maybe they covered it, but they didn't pay that much attention. They didn't study it in depth. And other biases or differences in this group compared to the entire Earth's population include things like they're mostly Americans, or at the very least Westerners. They're certainly richer than the average human on Earth. They're English speakers, and so a lot of these things inform the way they think about the world in a way that's hard for them to even notice about themselves.
Mm-hmm. I've not thought about space ethics. I've thought about ethics on Earth. I have thought about how messed up some things are on Earth. And so there are people who, I think understandably and justifiably think, with all that is going on right now on Earth, why is it that we should be thinking about the ethics around humans in space?
That's certainly a fair question, and especially with all the money that gets spent on space exploration, there's always a question of, is there a better way we could spend this money? Is there a better way we could spend our time and our expertise? And I have a couple of answers. One is that if we do think that humans are eventually going to be living and working in space, we need to start thinking about what their lives are going to be like as early as possible. We don't want to wait and figure it out later, because that'll just lead us to repeating the same kinds of harms and mistakes that we've seen on Earth, and there's no reason to do that. Why repeat the mistakes if we can learn from our past? But the other reason is something I think about a lot, because personally, I'm a bit less optimistic about how soon humans will be living and working in space than some people, your Elon Musks and such. I think I have a lot of expertise on how harsh the environment is in space and the technical challenges and the biological challenges. And so I think it's going to take us a long time, plus the economic challenges. There's not a clear business case yet. And so I don't think babies are going to be born in space, for example, in my lifetime. And so, in the darkest days of spending my time writing this book, I would go, why am I even doing this? Why bother thinking about this? Now I could be working on other things here on Earth, certainly. But I noticed something interesting as I researched, and especially as I talked to people about these issues, and even in myself, which is that thinking about all these different thorny problems in the context of a space settlement, this sort of sci-fi setting, lets us not only become more aware of these issues that already exist on Earth and the historical lessons we can learn, but it lets us think of more radical solutions to these problems than we would be able to think about on Earth. Because it's hard to figure out, the world is rough right now. I can imagine a better solution maybe, but I don't know how I would get there from here. But if you're thinking about starting from scratch in space, again, a science fiction kind of mindset, it's a lot easier to come up with these wilder solutions. And I think that's a good exercise, and it lets us imagine what kind of future we actually want for our descendants, both in space and on Earth.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question about the way that the book is structured. So each chapter and subsection of Off Earth comes in question form, and every section begins with 2 or more sort of fictionalized stories or scenarios that are set in the past, the present, the future. Why is that?
Yeah, so they're all questions. They're all titled with questions because I feel like the book is really just a list of questions without any answers sometimes. And that's because I don't have answers to most of these things. And I think that the questions are the most important part right now, is to ask, what are the possibilities here? What are the things we need to worry about? So that then smarter people than me can figure out the answers. But I did also start each chapter, as in the podcast, I started each episode with a couple of these little vignettes, as my editor called them, these little stories. Some of them were set in the past, so I had a whole chapter about why people might want to go to space, and I talked about different reasons that humans migrated across the planet in the past, and then the stories included just a couple little perspectives on what that might have looked like to an individual person. And then I would come up with a fictional version of you, the reader, being in a future space settlement and experiencing these same things. And the reason for that was to draw a connection between the struggles that our hypothetical future space settler might face and the struggles that our ancestors went through in the past and even today here on Earth. And fiction is sometimes the best way to do that. And science fiction, of course, has a lot of these same questions in it. And so you could say I was writing tiny little science fiction stories, too.
And do you feel like there are some answers that you are closer to now that you have written this book and engaged with people over what is in the book itself?
Oh, definitely. The best way to learn about a subject is to make a podcast or write a book about it, certainly. I learned more about the different problems. Those were the depressing days, of course. But I also learned so much about the ways that humans have solved these problems here on Earth. And that's what gives me hope. Is I said we need to learn from our past. There's certainly a lot of cautionary tales that we need to pay attention to so we don't end up repeating ourselves. But there's also a lot of really good lessons learned about the way that small groups of humans living in really harsh environments have figured out ways to live with each other, ways to protect the marginalized and powerless people among them, how to live with their environment in a way that doesn't overuse their environment. This has been done successfully and unsuccessfully on Earth, and so that gives me a lot of hope, too.
Can you provide an example that comes from the book?
Well, certainly there's a lot of indigenous cultures who have lived in really sustainable ways with their environment, both in the past and today. And even places like the US are learning a lot from that. I know that forestry management and preventative burning to prevent forest fires and things like that, this is something that has been talked about with the increase in forest fires in the US, that indigenous management of forests tends to actually have a much better result than the way that the European settlers came in and just clear-cut everything. And so things like that mean that we shouldn't just look at what we consider to be the most successful, in quotes, society here on Earth for lessons for how we should live in space. We should look at all the different societies, all the different ways to live here on Earth, and not just study them from afar, but also get those people involved in the conversation and get them involved in thinking about how we could use that knowledge in space.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. Let's return to our conversation recorded last month before a live audience at the James S. McDonnell Planetarium as part of Missouri Humanities' keynote event. Host Elaine Cha was talking with Erika Nesvold, the author of Off Earth: Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. Elaine asked how more people, and more people of diverse backgrounds, are being welcomed into conversations about space ethics.
I think it's getting better. We've mentioned earlier in this conversation that the private space industry in Silicon Valley is still pretty dominated by certain types of people, but that's slowly getting better as certain companies in particular are trying to become more diverse and trying to welcome more diverse voices. It's going too slowly, in my opinion. NASA and government agencies are also slowly trying to incorporate more of these viewpoints with a lot of stumbles along the way, but that doesn't mean the work's not being done. There are certainly a lot of people who come to this field of space ethics on their own, totally independently, sort of like me. They start thinking about their interests and their worries about humans. They start thinking about that in the context of space for whatever reason, and they start to get worried about it, and they start working on it, and then they start to find other people who are thinking along the same lines, and they're starting to form networks and communities. And that's part of what my nonprofit, the Just Space Alliance, is trying to do, is not tell everyone, hey, this is how you do space ethically. We're trying to serve as a sort of hub to connect all these people who are coming to these ideas on their own.
Mm-hmm. When we talked on the phone earlier this week in preparation for this conversation today, I had inquired about common questions that you get from folks when you're out speaking, during podcasts and that sort of thing, when you are a guest. And you had told me that people frequently ask about basics about the law and legal protections, and that Americans in particular want to know about the potential for revolutionary war. What do you make of that, Erika?
Yeah, so certainly a lot of the questions are basic stuff that a space lawyer can answer. I'm not a space lawyer, but I've talked to a lot of them. So who owns the moon? What are we going to do about if two different countries want to grab the same part of the moon? What are we going to do? There's legal answers to those questions, and there's treaties in place, and that sort of thing's been discussed a lot. But Americans in particular always seem to want to imagine a scenario where we make a space settlement, let's say on Mars, and then the settlement decides that they don't want to belong to America anymore, if they're an American settlement, and are we going to have another revolutionary war, and July 4th in space, et cetera, Star Wars. And part of that is because we watch a lot of movies, Star Wars. And another part of that, which was pointed out to me, I used to ask these questions, and I asked this question on my podcast to an expert, a colonial historian who studied not just the history of colonization in America, but all over the world. And she said, yeah, Americans are like that. What we don't realize, is that the U.S. breaking away from our mother country, the U.K., it was kind of rare throughout the history of humanity. Most colonies on Earth have stayed on pretty good terms with their parent nation. Now, this is specifically the colonies, the people of the original country in the new colonies. The colonized peoples have not generally had a good time.
Sure.
Let me be clear about that. But Australia, Canada, et cetera, they stay on good terms with their parent nation. We were kind of an exception. And so this colonial historian I was talking to said she thinks that in space it's going to be pretty similar, especially since a space settlement is going to be so dependent on Earth for such a long time that you don't want to pick a fight, start a war with the people who are still sending you crop seeds or medical supplies or technology or whatnot. Plus, that's where all the rest of the humans live. So she pointed out that most colonies, if you live in a colony, you had a lot of family connections back to your home country. You had a lot of financial prospects back there, and that'll probably be true in space as well. And that was nice for me to hear, because I don't think a space war would be a good time.
No.
And so hearing a little more of an optimistic take on the likelihood of war in space was nice.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're sitting together on a Saturday night We've come here willingly, I hope, for the most part. What settings do you think sort of pose the most potential for productive conversation about space ethics, apart from the kind of situation that we're sitting in right now?
Well, certainly a lot of these conversations take place when a bunch of space nerds get together, because they love imagining their future in space. But more and more of these conversations are happening amongst people who didn't necessarily go off and get a STEM degree and aren't astrophysicists. Maybe they watched a lot of science fiction as a kid too, or maybe they didn't. Maybe they're coming at this from a completely new direction just because they work in, let's say, criminal justice reform, and someone asks them, well, are we going to have prisons on the moon? And suddenly they start thinking about these issues, and they start talking to their peers, and you get really interesting conversations happening there too. And so that's something I really love to see. Don't get me wrong, I like talking to other space nerds, but I also love talking to people who just do fascinating work and had never considered their work in the context of space, but once you get them going, they can think through all those implications, and they can bring something really fresh to this sort of sci-fi story playing in our head.
Mm-hmm. So Science and the Humanities, this is a Missouri Humanities event. This is kind of new territory in some ways. What is not new territory, well, I guess relatively speaking, depending on what the context is, the division between science and humanities isn't organic, right? It is something that is human-made. It's a phenomenon that exists, has roots that go back, for some, really far, others not that far at all, to the latter part of the 19th century. And the way that we casually talk even about being right-brained or left-brained, that seems to perpetuate this idea that science and the humanities are opposites, that they do not belong together. What do we stand to lose by having that sort of attitude toward science and tech and the humanities, like that binary?
Yeah, that's a great observation. And one thing I'll add to your point is that it's really in Western cultures and societies where this divide has grown. I've talked to an indigenous scholar in particular, whose name I've forgotten at this moment, who pointed out to me that that's not the way his society sees learning and knowledge. It's not that you say, here's science and here's the humanities. They don't even divide up, well, within science there's biology and then there's physics and then there's chemistry. Every time you're learning about the world, you're learning about all these different ways of seeing the world, both the underlying physical, mechanical processes of it, but also what it means to you and what it means to your family and the way you relate to it as a person that you respect, even though it's a part of nature and not a human. And so they're all kind of bewildered when they look at the Western way of really separating things out. And it's not even the way it used to happen in Western societies, European societies. If you go back far enough in time, back in the Greek ancients who studied, the philosophers were also the ones discovering geometric equations and such. And I think there's quite a lot to lose. For one thing, it's really boring to just study one thing and only come up with one way to see the world. And I say that as someone who loves math a lot, but I'm also a human who enjoys the arts. I enjoy interacting with other humans and trying to figure out better ways to do that. And when I think about humanity's future in space, I'm not just thinking about a bunch of technology, a bunch of robots up there. I'm thinking about humans and what it'll be like to live in space, not just in terms of what kind of night sky we're going to see, which is, of course, interesting, but what kind of poetry we're going to write about the night sky that we see, and what kind of communities we're going to build. And to think about those things, you need the humanities.
Mm-hmm. Of the ethical questions that you have presented in the book, which is the one that seems to get people really thinking about ethics in a way that they had not before?
I'll give you two answers, which are both about how it changed the way I thought about ethics in a way I hadn't before. So most people are, again, familiar with property rights or how are we going to fight wars in space. And they're not too surprised at finding those chapters in the book. But there's a whole chapter in an episode of the podcast I did on criminal justice in space, which is not something I thought very much about. And then suddenly I was researching into this whole world of prison abolition, and there are whole societies and communities on Earth who deal with harmful behavior amongst their people without building prisons, and can we come up with some alternatives that work well on Earth that we could use in space so that we never have to build prisons in space? And yeah, suddenly I'm a prison abolitionist, and that's not what I expected when I went into space ethics. And another big area that most people haven't thought too much about yet, because it's still a long way in the future, is reproductive rights. Can we have babies in space? We don't actually know. We don't know if there's a biological challenge to that. We don't even know how to study that ethically, because most bioethicists frown on doing research on experiments on pregnant people and fetuses. And so that's just a huge medical knowledge barrier and also a huge ethical barrier. And even if we get past that, then there's questions about population control. How are we going to control if a population gets too big in a space settlement, or if it gets too small? What can we learn from all the different times that's happened here on Earth, and the harms that have come with doing population control? So lots of fascinating stuff in that area too.
Yeah.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. I'm Alex Hoyer. Let's return to our conversation recorded last month at the James S. McDonnell Planetarium. Elaine Cha talked with astrophysicist Erika Nesvold, author of Off Earth: Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. The conversation was part of Missouri Humanities' keynote event, and Erika and Elaine were talking about the idea of settling space versus visiting space.
The number of people who said they would want to settle space, stay there for the rest of your lives, is a lot less than the number of people who raised their hands earlier and said they thought humans should settle space.
Right.
So it's a much smaller group of people who want to make that first leap, which of course is pretty natural. It's scary. As I mentioned before, it's going to be really physically uncomfortable to go live in the early days of space. And most of us, when we stop to think about it, are pretty fond of this planet, and the nice benefits like being able to go outside without a spacesuit on and breathe the fresh air. But when it comes to the question of the people who do want to go live in space, how many of them would actually get to go? That gets kind of interesting, because right now there's more people who want to visit space than can. I've applied to the astronaut program twice, and they never answer my calls. And we can see of the astronauts that go up, it's a very narrow selection of human society that actually gets to go up and go into space. It tends to look different than most of society. For a long time, it was white male military guys, because Russia and the US were hiring from their test pilots. It's gotten a little more diverse since then, but there's also a lot of limitations on who gets to be a career astronaut. You have to pass a bunch of medical tests, including some really strict physical requirements. You have to have all your arms and legs. You have to be within a certain height range. You have to have good vision. And there's understandable practical reasons for that. NASA wants people to be able to fit in their spacesuits and their space capsules. They want them to be able to operate everything they need to do in space. And they don't want anyone with a kind of medical disease that's going to get them really sick in space, because nobody wants their astronauts to get sick in space. But that means that rules out a lot of people from ever being able to go to space. And there's some really interesting work being done by disability rights advocates saying, hey, actually, space is actually disabling for all of us. Maybe instead we should figure out how to make space and space technology more accessible for everyone. Because someday, if we do want to live in space, if we can figure out how to have babies born in space, multiple generations, we'll end up with disabled people in space anyway, through accident, illness, birth. And so they're working on things like, there's a program called Astro Access that sends disabled people up on parabolic airplane flights where they can simulate weightlessness for about 30 or 40 seconds. And they've taken people up who are, for example, deaf, and they want to see if they can have a sign language conversation if they're like oriented upside down to each other, or can blind people read Braille off the wall of the spacecraft or the airplane if they're floating. And they're doing really interesting work to really explore that problem in a way that hasn't been explored before.
Now for audience questions. If you could stand and state your name and your question.
Hi, my name is Rachel Grant. I have a background in social science, and I'm really interested in how people become radicalized, and it seems like one of the easiest way to radicalize a group of people is to isolate them and control how they get information, and it seems like it would be really easy to take control of the information that a space colony would have access to. So is anyone thinking about that and how we keep free information and protected from misinformation in space?
That is a great observation, and no, I haven't heard anyone talk about that specifically, but there's a number of books on tyranny and dissent in space. Controlling information flow, great observation. Another thing people have talked about is that surveillance will probably be really high because, of course, it's a fancy futuristic space kind of settlement. You're going to have cameras everywhere and automated systems, but that means that the people in charge will know everything you're doing, and there'll be very limited freedom. And if you want to, for example, express dissent, you want to protest against something you see as unjust, or you want to go on strike because your job, you're not getting paid enough in space. If you are in a sort of settlement where someone has central control of things like the doors or the spacesuits or the life support system, then it's really easy to squash a protest by just turning down the oxygen. And so people have talked about how to design liberty into these space habitats themselves, which is a very engineering thing to do. Let's solve dissent and liberty with spacecraft design. You also need to figure out how to design it into your cultural and legal and social systems as well. But I hadn't thought about information flow. That's a great observation.
Over to the left here.
My name's Sean Dingman. My question is, I realize this is a very controlled environment that I will be asking about, but are space ethicists looking at the interactions of the people on the International Space Station as kind of a starting point to address some of these questions, and have they made any progress with that?
Yes, people are certainly studying astronauts on the ISS. As you mentioned, it's a very controlled environment. It's a bunch of people who are just at work for 6 months and then they get to go home, and they've been trained and selected in order to be a certain type of person. All that being said, they're certainly being studied. They're definitely being studied medically. Everyone wants to know what's happening to their bodies over time. They're being studied in terms of their psychology, which overlaps, I think, with a lot of the sort of sociology interests. There are a few case studies that people point to. There was a Skylab crew that got upset with NASA, and some newspaper stories claimed they went on strike, which they didn't quite do, but they study stories like that. And we also study humans here on Earth in sort of analog environments like Antarctica or ships at sea to try to figure out how humans do act in these really weird, artificial, dangerous environments. And I think that'll continue to happen as humans go farther and farther out. There'll be so much we can learn just from watching them.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's John Seiler. I had a kind of a two-part question. People are probably going to be first settling because it's going to be economically advantageous, so probably mining, those types of things. And those companies who would help, start up mine settlements, those would be the first probably settlements, and then later human settlements. How do you see that being, kind of company culture starting that first and then trickling down? How do you see that affecting the outcome of human settlement?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of people talking about that exact scenario right now, because that does seem like the likely way that if we get space settlement soon, it'll be outgrowth from a mining outpost. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think 50 years ago we would have said that the space settlements would be national, settlements set up by the U.S. or Russia, and so it sort of depends on what finally pushes us out there. Is going to determine what starts this. But if it is mining or some other financial reason, then we have a lot we can learn from the past history here on Earth, especially about company towns. So for those of you who haven't hit company towns in your history classes yet, these were towns, I studied a bunch of them in the US, I'm sure they were elsewhere in the world, where everyone who lived in the town worked for the same company. And the company also rented the housing to you, and you had to shop at the company store, and maybe they didn't even pay you in real money, they paid you in fake company money, which was super convenient, but it also meant that the company controlled everything about your life. If they wanted to raise your rent but not pay you more, you were going to be in trouble because you didn't have an alternative. And so people worry that space settlements, especially if they grow out of something like a mining outpost, that they'll end up just being company towns. You don't have someone else you can go shop at their store and get cheaper food. You don't have alternatives of housing. Maybe your housing is assigned to you. It's unclear how they're going to get paid. And most importantly, in space, it's going to be really, really hard to just quit and move to another town. It's so expensive to take a rocket ship between planets in space. There's a big question of if you work on a mining outpost on Mars, can you quit? What does being employed and poor look like in space? And so, yeah, there's a lot of questions if we think about the scenario where profit is our first big push to go out there.
And before we go to our next question, I know that there are some young folks in here. I highly encourage you to ask a question if you've got one. This is not a space, no pun intended, for adults only.
Kids ask the best questions.
Yes. I think there's one back there.
Hi, my name's Nicole Meyer, and you talked about physical disabilities in space. What about educational disadvantages for those who don't have masters or PhDs in any of the sciences?
That's a great question. That is a big barrier right now to something like the astronaut program. Having applied for it myself, I can tell you need to apply for a NASA astronaut position, you need to either have a master's degree and 3 years experience or a PhD, and it has to be in certain fields, or you have to have 1,000 hours of jet piloting experience, which I don't have.
Easy.
That makes a certain amount of sense. Then they don't have to put someone through pilot school in order to send them to space. But if you look at what that means for who gets to be an astronaut, you have to be someone who not just can get into and complete one of those degrees, but someone who can afford to stop working and pay perhaps for tuition to get one of those degrees. And so that just rules out a lot of people. And what I thought you were going to ask about, I'll answer that question too, which is aside from physical disabilities, I've had a lot of conversations too about various mental disabilities and mental health issues that also tend to be disqualifying for space. But I've had a number of neurodivergent people point out to me the ways that their particular neurodivergence could make them even more useful in space. And so I think just increasing the diversity in so many ways in terms of our physical bodies, in terms of the way our brain works, in terms of the kinds of lives we've led here on Earth, whether we've grown up poor and not being educated or as educated as you can be, I think just increasing that diversity is only going to help us.
Hello, my name is Sean Harrell. I'm an educator, and keeping in line with what we were just talking about as far as education, creating access and encouraging diversity. It seems like a lot of your work, from what I've heard, involves with those things on the corporate level, but I'm curious to know as far as getting younger people and more diverse groups of younger people interested in astronomy and astrophysics, physicists younger. What have you seen that people are doing? What do you think best practices could be done better?
Great question, super important question. I'm not an educator, have a lot of education experience myself. There's a lot of people doing great work in that field. What I will say is that I've seen, on the other end of things, I've seen these space companies say things like, how can we get people to care more about what we care about humans going and living in space? And one thing, and they've tried a bunch of different things, mostly tried to explain to the population of the world why their work is so important to everyone. We're going to give you satellite internet, or we're going to mine a bunch of asteroids and make everybody richer, etc. And what I've tried to point out to them is, instead of trying to explain to people why your work is so important, maybe you should ask those people what's important to them. And I think this would work with students as well. What's important to them? What's important to their lives? What are their biggest worries and their biggest interests? And if you want to get them interested in space, what can space do for them and their interests, instead of just trying to project our obsession with asteroid mining onto everybody. And so I think this is something that a lot of educators try to do very well, is to try to figure out what is the interest of the student, and how can I show them how this topic helps them with those interests and those worries about the future. Okay.
Hi, my name is Samson, a language lover. So I wanted to know, we're speaking here right now in English. Is that going to be the space language? Just because there's Russians out there, Chinese, Japanese, and many different people who are interested in space.
Samson, thank you for your question. I'm the child of two linguists, so I'm going to use up the rest of our time answering this question, probably. Great question. Until recently, I think this has just changed, but until recently, NASA astronauts had to learn Russian as part of their training if they didn't know it already, because the International Space Station was built by English speakers and Russian speakers primarily, and so a lot of the manuals and technology are written in both. The Chinese space station is now going to be run by Chinese and Mandarin speakers. And so there's some really fascinating things happening with the intermingling of language in space. At the moment, it's mostly about, well, you're going to have to learn this big common language if you want to go to space, which can be its own barrier as well. I wasn't going to do this. I'll recommend the book that I co-edited that Elaine mentioned called Reclaiming Space. Has a wonderful chapter in it by a sci-fi author called Mary Robinette Kowal that's about the language of space, and she talks about a lot of these subjects. The other thing that really fascinates me, not so much to do with ethics, is to think about how language will evolve in a space settlement, because languages evolved in the first place with isolated communities who just talk amongst themselves until the language sort of diverges, and I think that's going to be fascinating, along with all the other ways that culture and interests are going to diverge too. So thank you so much for that question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all
Thank
for
you all
coming
so much.
today.
That's astrophysicist Erika Nesvold, author of Off Earth, Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. The conversation was part of Missouri Humanities' keynote event, and it was recorded last month before a live audience at the James S. McDonnell Planetarium. Our thanks to Erika, the folks at Missouri Humanities, and the St. Louis Science Center. St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Thanks for listening. I'm Alex Hoyer.
This episode was produced by Elaine Cha and edited by our executive producer, Alex Hoyer.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.